Well, I want to talk about throughout the state, many properties, including urban areas such as Trenton, large suburban professional office parks, and regional shopping malls have become underutilized, vacant, obsolete, and difficult to market in today's world. As a result, they've become known as stranded assets, creating an economic strain on the host community. The COVID-19 pandemic made things worse, with business shutdowns and ensuing work from home and hybrid model of working, thanks to swift implementation of various technologies. Today, our two panels of experts will discuss the crisis and the solutions from a government, both state and municipal standpoint, to an architectural, environmental, legal, community standpoint, and yes, an economic development standpoint. We're going to start with our first panel, Reframing Incentives for Stranded Assets, the government's role in stranded assets. All bios of our panelists can be found on the webpage by following the QR code on your agendas. So please help me to welcome Dan Jennings, Executive Vice President, Real Estate Development and Programs, New Jersey Economic Development Authority. Willard Alonzo Stanback, Acting Director, Department of Housing and Economic Development, City of Trenton. And Matthew Kertz, Partner, Genova Burns. I'm going to start with a question for Will. Will, what is the stranded asset scenario like in Trenton? How bad is the problem? And what are the issues and implications of stranded assets in a town or a community?
First, hey, John. First, thank you for having me on this panel and for inviting me for this particular program. I can go on for a while with that question. I will not. I will say that what we do have with respect to Trenton is, as many people in this room know, quite a few properties that are not being used. But we have the double whammy in that we have, with respect to our properties, over 50% of our properties are either government owned or is operated by religious organizations or churches. So we have a large base of properties that are not taxable. So that puts even more burden on the city with respect to what we're trying to do and the services we're trying to provide. So with respect to some of the assets we have and the fact that they're stranded, it means that we don't have the taxes to provide some of the services that we would like to provide at the levels that we'd like to provide them. We also have a situation where people will, especially if it's a residential, they break into those homes and use them for things that we would not want them to use it for, be it criminal base or for homelessness. And then we've had situations, as you can imagine, where someone has come in and used that property, and then maybe they're smoking a cigarette and then catches on fire. So then that puts more strain on us to have to deal with that property. We also have certain properties that are now being demolished, in part because they're not salvageable. The city has in itself about 2,000 plus properties that it owns that we're trying to figure out kind of what to do with it. Some of those properties are in redevelopment areas where we can actually have a relationship and do a deal with a potential purchaser of those properties. But other properties are outside, and those properties we can only, by statute, provide those for sale through auctions. So we have to do auctions on a fairly periodic basis. I think we're doing like once a year now to try to get some of those off. But there are a lot of things that are problematic, as you can imagine, without, number one, having so much land and so many properties that are not taxable, and then for the ones that could possibly be taxable, that they're not in use in ways where we can get revenue from them.
Okay, Willard, I'm curious, out of those 2,000 properties, how many are stranded assets? Would you know?
I would say almost all of them
All of
are
them?
stranded.
Wow,
because we have properties that are vacant lots, we have properties that are debilitated, we have properties that some of them also are coming to us through foreclosures. Mm-hmm. The perfect storm of problems is when we are getting a property that the owner hasn't been paying the taxes, we foreclose on it. It may have violations already against it from an inspection standpoint, and it may have tenants.
Okay.
So we have to kind of manage that with respect to how the city ingests those type of properties and hopefully manages those through a process to get it to somebody else who will take better care of those properties and better care of those tenants.
Very good. Dan, how, as a representative for the state, how bad is the problem in New Jersey that the EDA is involved now in providing solutions?
First of all, thank you for inviting us here to participate. I also want to acknowledge one of my colleagues in the audience, Nat Bodenheimer. So I also want to give credit to our CEO, Tim Sullivan. When he joined the EDA in 2018, he saw that stranded assets was going to be a growing problem in the state. And as you pointed out, the pandemic has made it worse. We just ran a CoStar report looking at buildings that were put into service before 2013, buildings with 100,000 square feet, and buildings with half of their space or 50,000 square feet or more vacant. And the report found there are more than 100 properties throughout the state. And I'm sure that number is much higher if you consider buildings with fewer than 100,000 square feet. And buildings that may not appear on CoStar. So, our feeling is, and we'll talk about in a minute, is this is a problem that neither the private sector, nor the property owner of the stranded asset, nor the municipality, county government can solve alone.
Very good. And of those properties, they're all over the state. They're in suburban settings,
Yeah.
they're in urban settings.
Yeah,
everywhere.
and they include the range of properties that you mentioned earlier. So we're talking about office campuses, shuttered hospitals, retail malls. There's all kinds of categories when it comes to stranded assets.
Okay, very good. Matt, as the attorney on our panel, as a real estate attorney, who do you normally represent on these issues? And in your experience, what have you seen and what are you seeing throughout the state?
Sure. So I represent the private side of this, the landowner or the redeveloper that is looking to redevelop the asset or to repurpose from what it's doing. And I would say that really you have to look at this as there are short-term repurposing and then there's long-term repurposing. There's overlap. In the context of short-term repurposing, it's often a creative solution with respect to leasing. A property owner has some asset that was used for X amount of years for one thing, and then they're looking to do something in the short term while they're weathering the market or they're looking for improvements. And then long term, just redevelopment, either knocking down the building or using the existing building to just have a different use of it.
Okay, could you, short-term repurposing, I never heard that term before. Could you just explain what that is for us?
Sure, that's when I talk about short-term repurposing, I'm talking about using an asset for whether it's just a few months in case of, a Spirit Halloween or something like that, where you're using something that isn't used at all for seasonal use, or if it's just for a couple of years while you're looking to redevelop the asset. So like self-storage units, until you knock it down and put up an office building or something like that.
Okay, very good. Will, so what programs and services is Trenton offering to help redevelop these 2,000 plus assets? And can you give us some examples of what worked and what hasn't?
Well, I want to make sure I also clarify that it's not all negative with respect to the properties that we have and the stranded assets. I mean, one person's view could be that there's opportunity where you have situations like this, and it's just a matter of how you manage the opportunity. So to respond to what you're asking, one thing that we're doing of late with the administration that was in play last 4 years, it was a little bit more challenging. We have a council now that's more leaning in with respect to what's going on in the city and in particular with respect to economic development. I think there's an understanding coming out of COVID that municipalities are all competing for businesses and for landlords and for people to come in and invest in their cities. The notion of a payment in lieu of taxes, which people call a pilot, had been somewhat negatively received by some people in the past. I think structured the appropriate way that this council is going to be more amenable to those type of things. But what we're looking for the potential buyers to do is to be very, very clear about the benefits that they're bringing to the city.
Okay.
And what was mentioned a little earlier was a notion about that you said, and that's going to be a very, very critical aspect of what we're trying to partner with people who are coming in and help them with, in terms of some of these assets and in terms of the acquisition and bringing the business up to speed if they're going to also be able to provide some jobs.
Okay. Could you give us a quick example of a most recent major project?
A major project. So this is not really an acquisition situation. I can tell you what just came through council earlier this year. Brunswick Village is a facility that's in the northern part of Trenton, and they're doing a pilot. But what they're doing is for residential space. But what they're doing also is they're going to use some of their money to revamp the location and the kitchens and the bathrooms and things like that. So when council was presented with that, they could see the benefits of providing this payment in lieu of taxes with respect to that particular project because they saw the benefit to the residents of that particular facility.
Very good. Dan, what are the many incentives that the NJBIA is providing developers, businesses, local governments in the adaptive reuse arena?
Sure. So let me say that, again, credit to Tim Sullivan, our CEO, who foresaw this issue. So in 2021, we awarded grants to 6 municipalities and 1 county to study or create plans for stranded assets in their communities. This was called the 21st Century Program. Last year, we awarded 10 grants to municipalities, public agencies, parking authorities, to develop plans for stranded assets in their communities. And this is the Asset Activation Grant, which is a program that we're actually going to renew. Now, that's the planning side. On the implementation, execution side, I'm sure most of the people in the audience are probably more interested in that. The incentive programs include Aspire, which is our main incentive program for real estate projects, where projects can get between 45 to 60% of eligible cost if there is a financing gap. We also have a brownfield tax credit program or tax incentive program. We know that many stranded assets have environmental issues. That program is about to launch. Eligible projects can receive between $4 million and $8 million as a tax credit. We have a historic tax credit program. We just closed a round, but we expect to renew that program next year. And then one program I'm going to mention that we're about to launch is a stranded asset fund. And unfortunately, I do have to leave early because we're bringing this fund to our board this morning. So I'm sure many of you won't mind me leaving early. So the stranded asset fund, it's a $25 million fund. We're looking to invest in the repositioning of 2 to 3 assets. The guidelines are pretty flexible. We can make those investments anywhere around the state. So if you're interested or you know someone who might be interested, please do get in contact with us. We can start having conversations June 1st. So again, assuming we get board approval today. The other thing I want to mention, particularly for municipalities, we are going to stand up a property assemblage fund where municipalities can acquire a stranded asset. And we expect to stand up this program before the end of the year. So those are, I think, a tool. And again, it's a recognition that repositioning, rehabbing stranded assets is a very expensive proposition that we know that, not one sector can tackle alone.
Okay, got a question. Can a developer take advantage of, a couple of those incentives all at once, or is it just one program?
So we allow developers to stack incentive programs. So for instance, with the Aspire program, you can couple it with, say, the Brownfield tax credit or the historic tax credit program and go up to 80% of eligible project costs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very
So
good.
Anthony, I'd like to add to that.
Sure.
The city and the state have been talking quite a bit about the notion of stacking and also about understanding with respect to the different programs where we can apply a particular tool set of stacking to a particular set of buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not going to necessarily see one size fits all in terms of the arrangement, but I think the state has been very supportive in terms of having a conversation about how we can do these things, bring in maybe county money if there's county money, city money, or support if there is.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say with this particular type of asset, this is what all is available to help with funding or redevelopment or whatever the case may be with respect to that property.
Very good. Thank you. Matt, can you give us some examples of what went well and what didn't in engaging with your clients? What were some of the lessons learned?
Sure. Well, in some cases, everyone's, let's say you represent a property owner with a stranded asset. Let's say it's a nonprofit or a religious institution that has community or input from different factors, and they don't want to let go of the asset. It's really ripe for redevelopment, but the community or the group just doesn't want to let it go. In that case, we've bid it out for both sale and then a long-term 100-year lease.
Mm-hmm.
Or 150 years or something like that. And that's one thing where we've been able to get over the idea of letting go of an asset, having it retained within the organization, but still let somebody else take control and redevelopment
Mm-hmm.
when they're done.
Okay. How common is that a community does not want a redevelopment of a stranded assets for whatever reason? Because I'm thinking, okay, these properties are not bringing in ratables, right? In our conversations, some communities or towns want them, but what are some of the reasons that communities don't?
Sometimes if there's a historical significance attached to it, even if the asset is falling down and there are problems and costs associated with moving or fixing it up, or it's or there's a desire not to let in a large development in a place where it's very, very well situated for it. It's near public transportation and so on. The changing of the neighborhood is often not looked at very well unless it's approached in the right way.
Okay. And in our conversations, you talked about always negotiating a greater window as possible to give the developer a chance to back out of a deal. I mean, could you explain that, and what are the possible market forces that, would make that happen?
Sure. So in negotiating a deal relating to the redevelopment, there needs to be a sufficient window of time in order to secure all of the approvals that are needed. And we've been needing to extend that window of time to longer than typical. So while I would say before COVID, it might take a year, maybe a year and a half to secure all of the approvals relating to redevelopment or state and other governmental approvals needed. But in recent times, that process has gotten longer and longer.
Okay.
Also, the cost of money. Sometimes securing the approvals is just one part of the equation, and the financing and the ability to secure financing at certain rates has significantly changed over the last year or 2 years. So the costs of that, construction materials, they've just gone up. And so the developers are looking for more ways that they can control the project.
Okay. Very good. Willard, what is Trenton trying to attract first? Does the city strive for housing, including multifamily, versus attracting businesses first? Is there a game plan?
Well, I can tell you the great prophet I know, George Soar, has told me that the retail follows the rooftops. So I think we want to make sure that we have a residential base that makes some sense, but we have to be mindful of not getting too much into the chicken and the egg type of situation. So we need to do both. We already know from some studies that I'm sure George is going to talk about later that there's a residential demand. So we know we need to do something with respect to our residential. But at the same time, we need to be very, very thoughtful and clear on the amenities and the businesses and other types of things that need to come along with those residents. So we're not just building out, businesses that don't make any sense to for the population that we have. We also have the added benefit of 5 years ago, Trenton did a master plan, the Trenton 250 plan. So if you go to trenton250.org, you can see that. And in that plan, they had a lot of community engagement with respect to what the communities wanted. And we're trying to follow that plan with the aspirations of being there in 2042. So that's our kind of guiding light with respect to what we're going to do with residences and with businesses.
Okay, very good. This is for everyone, this question. How do you get everyone involved? The state, the developer, the community, the financiers? What are the challenges there in getting everyone at the same table and going in the same direction?
Well, I can start with that. I think first you want to have the right environment so people can see that everyone's going to at least listen to each other. And you have to make that very, very clear. And then you want to, from a relationship standpoint, understand what people really are trying to achieve. And not every partner is going to be a good partner. And you have to be willing to step away from that. So you have to look at it and say, are they aligned in general with what we're trying to do? And then once you figure out there's alignment, then you focus on that. There are going to be differences and there's going to be negotiation, but you want to make sure that the people you're dealing with are people that you are truly in line with in terms of what you're trying to do, both as a property, but also as a community.
Okay. Dan or Matt?
So I know at the EDA, we always attempt to widely advertise our opportunities. And the same goes with the programs that I mentioned. So please do get in touch with me if you want to learn more. We're always available to have conversations. I know in the case of the Stranded Assets Fund, we'll be having a public seminar. Property Assemblage Fund, we're going to have a brainstorming session to take ideas from the public. But yeah, we want to talk to everybody basically and find out, if and how we can work together.
I would just say that just from the redeveloper, the property owner perspective, it's the willingness to engage with the community to show how this repurposing of the land is going to benefit the community. Where you had a derelict building, now you're going to have something vibrant, show the benefits and willingness to listen to the public if they want a little park in the area or something like that. you need to be willing to have those conversations.
Okay, very good. Do we have time for one more question before we open it up to the Q&A? I believe so. Just looking at what can happen, especially in the housing market, is there a concern about gentrification and pricing people out of the market when you redevelop these assets and create, a nice luxury complex?
Are we doing that to me?
Yeah.
I think it's.
So I'm happy to. So it's interesting. That question does come up a lot, and look, it is an issue in a couple of our municipalities. A place like Jersey City, where there's such a difference between the market rent and affordable rent. I don't think it's been a problem that in other areas. So I take the Newark example, where there's been robust market rate housing development. And the mayor has done a good job of making sure that those projects include an affordable component. I know for our Aspire program, we demand that the project includes at least 20% affordable. So those units are going to stay affordable for the life of the project, basically, at least the first 30 years. I think as long as we're producing a good balance of inventory, a good balance of market rate housing and affordable, and that equation is going to vary from community to community. Like, what's that right balance? But I think if you're doing both, it won't be a problem in most places. I'm not going to say it's not a problem in certain places, but I don't think it will be a problem in most places.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think part of, if you look at Trenton specifically in our numbers, we're looking at a city where approximately only 38% of the population own their own homes. So that's a big concern in terms of the wealth of the community and also the wealth of the families that are here. So I do think if you look at the transit-oriented district we have around the train station and some other places, market rate or affordable or whatever, that you can understand and I can appreciate, building up and having those units there. But when you look at some of the other communities, I think we also need to focus on how do we, somewhat in respect to gentrification or not, how do we make sure that the people who are here have the ability to own their own homes?
Okay, very good. And I have time for another question. In our conversations, we were talking about attracting new industries. Matt, what do you see as up and coming industries that would be great to for a stranded asset?
Two come to mind, and they've been talked about a lot. In North Jersey, we're seeing industrial assets being repurposed into film uses, and that's been a very exciting development. A lot of jobs, a lot of benefits to the area as well when that happens. And we're involved in that. The other use that I'm seeing really across the board, municipality by municipality, is repurposing old assets for cannabis use. Grow facilities, but also just all along the delivery spectrum.
Okay, very good.
Actually, I'd like to dovetail on that, Anthony. One of the challenges Trenton has, and in my past life, I was an entertainment lawyer, so I was a little involved in that industry, is that with the tax incentive that New Jersey has, it's great for us to cultivate that industry. But because we're not in the circle from like 25 miles from Columbus Circle in New York, and we're not across the river from Philadelphia, it's a little bit more challenging for us to have things that are actually filmed here. But that goes to that notion of one of the things we could possibly do, and we've been talking about it, is building up our labor force here. So that's in that industry. We have the Mercer County that has a pretty good program that teaches film and production. And if we can, from a workforce standpoint, build up that labor force, and it makes it a little bit more amenable to have that type of film industry here in this central New Jersey area.
Okay, very good. Okay, with that, we're going to go right to the Q&A. Perfect timing. Okay, so if anyone has a question out in the audience, I'm sure our panel here will do their best to answer. Go ahead.
Dan, can you expand upon the new program for incentives for environmental remediation of projects?
Yeah, so if it's an environmental remediation project, we have our brownfield tax incentive program, which basically works more as a grant that comes into the project, you know, as the remediation is being completed. So you may have to bridge finance that. If you want further details, I can certainly talk to you and give you the name of the person who runs that program. Aspire kind of operates the same way. Think of it as it's a little bit more of a grant than a loan. But again, it's a grant that comes into the project upon the completion of construction. So, and depending on how you're monetizing, depending on the tax investors that you bring to the project, and depending on how those tax credits are financed. So you probably have to get a bridge, like the residential developers we're working with, or actually residential and commercial developers we're working with. What they'll normally do is bridge finance the tax credit, because you need to finance it during the construction. And then they'll try to get the proceeds from the tax credits upon construction. So they'll work with a lender, and the lender says, in exchange for buying these tax credits, I'll give you X% on the dollar upon the completion of construction. But I'm happy to talk to you more about the mechanics. You can always reach out to me. Yeah.
Yes?
Okay, so this is from our Zoom room. Where do we get more information regarding the fund program?
I guess, is that the EDA, the new EDA fund program?
Oh, the stranded assets. Where do we get more information? Just call me. So it's again, to repeat, it's $25 million fund where we're looking to invest and take risk with the property owner or a buyer who has the asset under control. And we're looking for a plan to reposition that asset. Our money can be patient, it can be flexible. We're looking to share in the upside to the extent there is upside, but it's not a traditional loan where we're requiring immediate payback or on the loan. So again, it's very flexible, and we're structuring that way, understanding that we may get a variety of proposals.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you. Oh, we do. Let's see. Okay.
Hi, Dan touched on some state incentives that are available. I was wondering if there's just any Trenton-specific programs or incentives that are separate from what the state provides.
We do have a couple of things. We have the UEZ funding that we're getting from the state. So depending on what you're doing, and if you're in a UEZ zone, there may be some things that we can do to help. There are also some things that we may be able to do with respect to workforce. So it kind of depends on the project and the level. We would try to partner, like we talked about before, with the state with respect to certain things, so that we may not be doing the whole bill ourselves, and we try to combine the funds. But like Dan said, you can reach out to me, and I can get you in touch with the people who manage that a little bit more than I do.
Okay. That's it. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Very informative panel.